So I've got the privilege and pleasure to be the first speaker today, and it's actually probably with a very good topic. I actually met a lot of people in the corridors, and everyone said, "Ah, you're the chef. You're going to talk about food." Actually, I'm not. I'm not going to talk about food. But actually, the topic of my title is the journey from perfectionist to imperfectionist, and this gives me a very interesting advantage over everybody else. Basically, it means if I screw up, it could be a part of the talk because I said it's about it being imperfect, right? So imagine at 19 years old, you're given the keys to a kingdom. That's what happened when I was named executive chef of Otto's fine dining restaurant in London. I was given my very own pirate ship, a place where I could push the borders and test the boundaries. For me, it wasn't just enough to make great food. It had to be breakthrough. It had to be revolutionary, or else it wasn't worth doing. So after a very short period of time, I ended up scaring away those sorts of people who were not 150% committed, friends, family, and employees. And within probably the preceding 2 or 3 months, I lost about 60% of the team, either through the fact that they quit or through a profanity-filled rage, mid-service, full restaurant. And one of the darker days came when it kind of reached a crescendo. Once again, still 19. And it took 4 of us, and this is how absurd it was. It took 4 people to plate this one particular dish. And I still remember the chaos in this London restaurant. And there's 4 people turning around this plate. Every single different little detail, right? I actually claimed to Vogue magazine that there was one dish that I did, 27 flavors in 3 mouthfuls. True story. And I took that plate as perfect as what I thought it was, and I put it up on the pass, and I called for service, and the light caught it in a very funny way. And I saw at that point, I didn't see food anymore. All I saw was watermarks on the plate. So the next part's a little hazy. But all I can remember is that plate exiting my hand, and the poor unfortunate kitchen hand who ended up, that plate ended up landing on the back of his head. But the reason why I tell you this story is because in my early years, and I'll tell you that it's probably up until about 3 or 4 years ago, I used to use the notion of perfection as a way to justify obsession over very, very, very small details, for obsessing on the maniacal details. Some would say that every big picture is made up of 1,000 small details, including myself. But the reality is, the big picture isn't a big picture without the details, right? So therefore, they kind of feed into each other. There's a little known fact that in the last, let's exaggerate this, in the last 200 years, we've seen a decline in the usage of the notion perfection. But anecdotally, we've seen a rise in the understanding and the justification of the notion of perfectionist, right? And I think as a human being, I think we were seeking and searching for opportunities and ways where we could describe to people that what we were going through wasn't some kind of a mental instability. It's just something called caring, right? So this kind of began my journey. The way that I look at perfection, or perfectionist, depending on which way you use it, the way that I look at perfection is really in 2 parts. One is the pursuit of excellence. And the pursuit of excellence is all about the journey. And it's almost irrelevant of the destination. And then there's perfection itself, which almost exclusively excludes the journey and focuses just on that destination. So I have a question. First of all, how many people have, let's see a show of hands, how many people have ever tried and failed at anything? Expected, right? 100% of the people. How many people then, after that failure, picked themselves up, dusted themselves off, and tried again? A little less. Okay, good. How many of you have used the notion and the understanding of perfectionist to describe when you go so deep on something that it makes no sense to somebody else? Even less. Good. So what would you say if I told you that by changing your understanding and your definition of perfection, we could actually create more opportunity and potentially make the world a better place, if for nobody else but for yourself? More opportunity is better, right? Awesome. So let me give you my less than mathematical equation for how I see perfection and excellence, right? What I say is that failure equals success. Therefore, success must equal failure, right? So I'm going to give you a little story. So when I started my most recent company, it's called Chew, I ended up hiring one of my very early food scientists, and it was like a brick to the face. I very quickly understood that this thing that was so embedded in my DNA, right? This caveman-like, try it until it works, do more of what works and less of what doesn't, isn't necessarily in the DNA of every other different profession. So this particular food scientist, I asked him, I said, how about, wouldn't it be awesome if we could make a just add water, cereal and milk? Because we've always got bottles of water, but we don't have a bottle of milk, so wouldn't it be great to have it on the go? Which seemed fairly straightforward in reality, in theory, but in reality, I think it was very different. So after probably 4 or 5 days of these endless speculation and conjecture and how about this and how about that, through the eyes of a chef, I'm thinking, well, when are we going to get to the stage where we actually do it? So on the 5th day when he came back, I put a bowl on the table, poured the cereal into the bowl, grabbed a bottle of water, poured it over the top and said, there we go, cereal, just add water, cereal and milk. And he said, how did you do that? And I said, basically, it wasn't rocket science. I did the only way that I knew how. Did a bunch of stuff. Most of it failed. I ended up feeding the trash can all day long, but at the end of the day, I had a proof of principle. And that proof of principle enabled me to get to that next step. Whereas if we had have just speculated ourselves to death, chances are a harebrained idea like that, with no clear understanding of what technique was required, chances are we probably would have killed it before we even started. So in this particular case, the reason why I make that reference to this particular slide is basically if we didn't fail all the way, and we didn't pivot and adjust and apply our critical thinking, then we would never have gotten to that particular point, and therefore the trails wouldn't have been blazed, etc. Here's another great example. So I actually didn't know this until probably honestly about 3 weeks ago, that to an untrained eye, a Persian rug looks like it is a thing of beauty and a thing of perfection. But actually, the people, the craftsmen and crafts-ladies who are making this, they actually sew in, if that's probably the proper term for making a rug, they put in an imperfection within the rug because, according to tradition, the only perfect thing in this life of ours is God. So therefore, there can't be anything on this earth that is deemed or defined as perfection. So that was an interesting thing. So somewhere within this, we see the beauty in imperfection, but it should necessarily translate through to the rest of our life. So then we get to a little theory that I love, which is called failing fast. How many companies have you ever heard of in their mission statements and their guiding principles? Have you ever heard things like courage, courage to fail, trailblazing, doing something different, etc.? They're pretty much all on the walls of every corporation in America and the world today. How many of those corporations, how many of those people in those corporations do you truly believe are living by the letter of that law every day without fear for their jobs? Probably not many. So what I actually did as penance for this maniacal, crazy life that I was leading around perfection, to get rid of my perfection demons, the pendulum swung all the way the other way. And actually, I ended up creating a company where right now, if people aren't failing enough, that then initiates a counseling session. Because the expectation is that in order to find something truly unique, you need to fail on average, and this is an average, I'm not recommending that you do failures just to get your numbers up, but you need to fail on average about 95% of the time in order to find 5%. And a lot of people say, wow, you're going to get kicked for 95% of the time by life, and only for 5%. But the difference is, the reason why I say that is that 5% is absolutely worth that 95%, because you know for a fact how many times that process nearly broke you. You know, frankly, I know for a fact no one would have gone through those particular details to get to that destination. But it's only a failure if you do it once. After that point, it becomes a complete screw-up, and that's not acceptable. So there is a little bit of a change in one's thinking that's required. And that particular change is to stop using the notion of finished. Stop believing something is ever finished, right? Imagine, let's use for an example the tech industry. Imagine if Apple ever said, well, the iPhone's good enough, it's finished, we're done, right? You wouldn't be, it would probably save us a lot of our lives and a lot of money. but you wouldn't be lining up for 5 days in the snow and the rain and the news cameras there waiting to capture you like an idiot on the street in your tent just to get the new iPhone, even though you could have waited and you could have ordered and had it 2 weeks later. But still, there's something in the compulsion of these tech companies. One is obviously definitely profit. But the other thing is imagine if we applied that same principle to every other company. Imagine if that same principle was applied to food and beverage companies. Imagine that you've spent millions of dollars creating, marketing, branding, launching that product. Now imagine someone comes to you a couple of months later and says, hey, guess what? We found a better way to do that. What if those companies were to say, hey, great, let's do it. Let's forget about the money we invested. Let's evolve this product. And it's exactly the same with a band. Imagine if a band is on the road and they're playing the same songs to the same audiences in different cities of every country in the world. Do we really think we'd be upset if those particular bands who have played those same songs hundreds of times, if they went back and they changed those songs? Because chances are the artists who are performing it actually probably are the best judges to say, hey, I know how to make this better. But still, sometimes we end up very rigid in our track. There's something as well I discovered in this particular process of perfectionist to imperfectionist, which was, there was a study done not so long ago, which was the difference between a human drummer and a mechanical drummer, and which one was more appealing to the human ear. And as it turns out, we actually prefer that from a human drummer because of the fact it's filled with imperfections and it's unpredictable. Whereas you can't train a machine to be unpredictable and imprecise. So I've surmised this really basically down to 3 rules, the 3 rules that I call basically about innovation. One is, impossible is simply a moment in time. I ban in my particular life, everybody around me knows this, I ban the usage of the word impossible because I believe right now it may be impossible, but infinity is a very long time, and I guarantee you one day we're going to figure out how to do most of this stuff. The second part is, if it feels forced, no one will consume it, right? Goes exactly the same for music. If you try to make music with the consumer in mind, or if you try to make food with the consumer in mind, you end up doing what I did basically in my very early years of cooking, which was, at a certain point, I couldn't take the criticism anymore. I couldn't stand the fact that someone could come into my restaurant one week and they could be physically at the table crying because they were actually so moved emotionally by something they couldn't explain. And then the next week someone would come in and they'd be so scandalized by that same piece of food that they thought it was the worst thing they've ever tasted. So eventually I ended up diluting everything I was doing. So basically I was generally good for everybody, but not specifically good for anyone. So that was a big lesson. And then perfection is sought, but rarely ever found, right? That's a really hard notion to grapple with because typically people are always looking for an end point. And people say, what do you mean there is no end point? What do you mean we've got to keep going? That's innovation. So imperfection is the new perfect, right? We've all heard in songs and things like that, perfectly imperfect and things like that. At the end of the day, we need to decouple our perception of success or failure on ourselves based off the success or failure of our tests or the expression of what we do. That we can't get it right all the time, but that doesn't mean you have to stop trying. So I think this one sums it up perfectly, right? Marilyn Monroe, I mean, she wasn't necessarily considered the pinnacle in innovation, but perfection is beauty, madness is genius, and it's better to be absolutely ridiculous than absolutely boring. Amen. Thank you.